Today I'm in the Cherry Hill Cemetery in Greenville, North Carolina. I'll be doing a quick walk through the African American section of the cemetery. Partially as a follow-up to a Cemetery Sunday article from a couple of weeks ago. Also just to give you an idea of what to look for if you're visiting a cemetery in the South. And if you're particularly interested in African American history or just cemetery history in general. Now, one thing about this part of the cemetery, you can see it's separated from the rest by hedges. There's an entrance here and another hedge here. These hedges separate the African American part of the cemetery from the white cemetery. So as we come into the cemetery, it doesn't necessarily look that different at first glance. You have an assortment of markers, landscaping. Here's the hedge again. And back around. This is the rest of the cemetery, which is the white section. Well, let's go along and take a closer look at some of the markers. One of the first things you might notice are these flat crypts, flat vault markers. From what I've been able to find out, they're more tombstone than crypt, and that a lot of times they're just sitting on the surface and don't form a vault around the burial. They often have the funeral home's name at the foot, and the name and date of the deceased at the head of the marker. There's another one here. It's a slightly different style, and it's more like the top of a coffin. In eastern North Carolina, these are strongly associated with African American grave. You see a lot of them on Zara. It's an African American cemetery. Now, something else you may notice about this part of the cemetery. The ground is not as level as the rest, and it actually slopes off pretty steeply towards the back. We'll work our way towards that. And the other thing is there's a pretty good variety of marker styles. This is a city cemetery. The surviving markers are predominantly granite, marble, a few concrete ones, which are durable materials. In part because it's a city cemetery, I suspect there are more marked graves like this. When you get into the more rural cemeteries, you see fewer markers. A lot of graves are marked just with wooden tombs, with wooden slabs, and they've, of course, rotted away. So let's go take a look at some of the rest of the cemetery. Here you can see another group of markers. Possibly vandalism, possibly a marker style. It looks like there were some additional components to this set of markers that are gone now. Behind them you can see more of those flat vault or crypt type markers. You can kind of see where the land slopes off. Something else that might be a clue that it's an African American cemetery. This is actually the maintenance road for the cemetery. I don't think it runs directly over any graves, but this is the only part of the cemetery it really runs through like this. And you can see that it's just not quite as well kept as the rest. We're under a large magnolia tree now. You can see another marble base, although the actual slab is missing, or the tablet portion of the grave is missing. Come on up. There's a lone broken column standing guard under that corner. I have read that there are numerous other graves under this tree, although they may not be marked. We have a sort of outcropping over here with this one or two solitary graves on it. Of course, adjacent to the cemetery, there's some construction going on for, I believe it's going to be condos. Now standing the downhill edge of the cemetery, just to give you an idea of the land here, how it slopes. As you can see, there's a pretty good drop off. Graves pretty much end along the edge of the drop off. As I said, this is the African American part of the cemetery. Segregation was a part of law and a part of life in the South prior to the late 50s and 60s. Most people, of course, are familiar with buses being segregated, churches, schools, universities. Not everybody seems to realize that cemeteries often were as well. City cemeteries would either be two separate cemeteries for white or black. They would be white only, and the African American community would have to just fend for themselves, find their own burying places. Or if there was one community cemetery, often it would be segregated, and there would be some form of marker to distinguish the two areas. Here, as I said, you have a hedgerow that goes all the way around this part of the cemetery. There's a couple of gaps in it to allow maintenance vehicles through. The trees are going to block part of the view. But it goes all the way around. This is the hedgerow that separates the African American portion of the cemetery from the rest. In southern cemeteries in which there were African American and white burials, you often see some sort of physical marker which separates the different areas. Sometimes they're brick walls, sometimes you have fences. But there's always some physical separation. Sometimes they are separate cemeteries altogether. Either the city provided two cemeteries, or the African American communities had to find their own burial places. This is not Greenville's only African American cemetery. There is another larger cemetery, but this is the oldest one. Now when I say oldest, I mean the oldest city-owned. There are older cemeteries in the county, some of which have African American graves and burials. However, this one was deeded to the city in the late 19th century. Now this is partially, like I said, a tour of this cemetery that I've talked about before in an earlier post. But also just to give you a general idea, when you're visiting cemeteries throughout the South, and you noticed areas set off separate, to give you an idea of what they might be. Now, depending on the age and history of the cemetery and community, there are other reasons an area might be set aside, religious denominations, and other factors, but segregated cemeteries are very common in the South. So that's something you'll find pretty commonly. I'll be continuing this video series as I visit more cemeteries and have time to put the videos together. I hope you've enjoyed this one. Hope you've learned something. And keep your eyes out for the next installment.